My name is Kate Emmerich. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I work for Quillen College of Medicine across campus from where I assume most of you are. I'm a mental health counselor for our medical students, their spouses, residents, fellows, and biomedical students. And at the moment, it is literally just me. Very busy over on this side. I've heard from people on your end that the Office of Equity and Inclusion is very busy as well, which is something that I like to hear. And I am here today because I was told that some people have been asking about addressing burnout and resilience. And I also heard interest in grief, but I felt that for a presentation of this length, that might be a little bit too much to try and do all in one presentation. So today's presentation is going to be focused more on addressing burnout and fostering resilience. So I'll start by talking a little bit about definitions. I'm just going to move you all around a little bit so I can see my PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So for burnout, at the most basic level, burnout is often considered the result of chronic stress in the workplace, manifest in a set of specific mental and physical symptoms. Potential causes for burnout. I did a lot of research with some academic articles around these topics. I'm just sharing some of the information that I gleaned from those that I thought were interesting perspectives on the idea of what burnout is. So one of these articles talked about it being the idea of people living to work rather than working to live. A problem at work thus affects the person as a whole, not just his or her professional life. So I don't know if that rings true for any of you. I know that that's certainly rung true for me in the past, and more recently, it's something that I work on consistently in the kind of work that I do. And then they were using this case study of a woman who they were studying burnout around in terms of how she was functioning as an employee. And they were saying that by trying to counter the strain that she was experiencing at work quantitatively, just the amount that she had to do, by working harder and longer and sleeping less, she found that she became slower, less productive, increasingly unable to concentrate, and more volatile. So just kind of give you the idea that when we think about, I think culturally, we oftentimes get the messaging, and this is going to come up more in my presentation as we talk about this, but we tend to get the messaging that the harder that we work, the more excellent our work will be, or the more time and energy we put into the things that we do, the more excellent they will be. And that, of course, sometimes is absolutely true. But in terms of longevity and in terms of trying to prevent something like burnout, it's really something to consider. So a new conceptualization also around burnout that I found in doing this research was that it's seen as more a systemic issue, which I guess can be good or bad. I was going to say it's promising because the good news is it's not an individual shortcoming on your part. And I think that that's really important when I do work with clients, for instance, when I'm talking with people one-on-one, or just as you are thinking about this for yourself. A lot of us have experienced burnout or are currently experiencing burnout. And it's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because it's a very natural response to a situation that maybe is kind of unnatural, is something that culturally we communicate as very natural, or we are taught is very natural, but in fact is actually not. And then our bodies respond to that over time, and then we experience the consequence of that in terms of symptomology. And so the World Health Organization recognizes burnout as an occupational phenomenon, not as a specific issue for individuals. So some of the signs and symptoms of burnout, and this is not an exhaustive list, but they at least include developing levels of cynicism, denial, depersonalization, levels of depletion, depression, excessive and prolonged stress, exhaustion, reduced professional efficacy, and withdrawal, both at work and in other areas of your life. And the WHO estimates that a loss of productivity resulting from sick leave related to mental diseases, I probably wouldn't use the word disease, I'd say mental health disorders, such as depression and stress-related disorders, costs Western economies billions each year. So even if you don't care about a person's well-being as an individual, we can even look at this from an economic perspective, that short-term, perhaps a person over-functioning might be a positive, beneficial thing financially for an organization or a company. But the reality is that longevity wise, in terms of like the long-term planning, it actually, when you think about as a university, we talk a lot about strategic planning and trying to plan and prepare for the future and have ideas of how things are going to look 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what those larger picture plans are. This gives, a little bit of light into the consequences when we don't address individual burnout or systemic burnout. And it does impact us as individuals as well. So when we experience burnout, it impacts the thoughts that we have, the emotions that we experience, the behaviors that we engage in, and it takes a significant toll on our bodies. And a lot of the work that I do with clients is around the mind-body connection, learning how to bring ourselves out of our minds and more into our bodies, because we hold so much of these things physically. And the long-term consequences of that, especially in working in the medical field now with medical students and residents and fellows, is that it actually directly impacts our physical health over time. So here are some ideas around prevention. And I want to be clear as I share these that I am aware that not all of these tips and tricks may be realistic for everyone, depending on your position, depending on the type of environment you work in or the supervisor that you have, or maybe the burnout you're experiencing isn't specifically related as much to work, but other areas of your life. So really take these as suggestions and possibilities for yourself. The idea of this is just to open up sort of our ideas of our relationship with burnout and things that we might possibly be able to entertain considering. And also entertain, and it's going to be some scary thoughts for a lot of us, but entertaining the idea that if these things are absolutely not possible where you are, then like what needs to change within your life in order to be living an existence in your body and in the space that you live in and work in and love in, that is more positive and well and balanced for you. So to start being realistic, maybe taking a step back and talking yourself through, knowing who I am and what I am capable of. What is realistic about what can be accomplished in a day? What's realistic about what can be accomplished in a week, or more than that? When I say you don't always have to be a hero, not everyone sees heroism in this necessarily, but I do think that the internal story for a lot of us, because of a lot of cultural communication and marketing and just conversations and just its experience in different workspaces, is that we're very results oriented. And so oftentimes what will happen is we will connect positive experience or approval or positive reinforcement when we get it to functioning at a very high level. And so we sort of equate those things, that like me being excellent means I have to consistently be producing at this level. And for a lot of people, long term, it's not reasonable. And so we want to conceptualize ways of working in our lives or functioning in other areas of our lives for the long term. And that's still that strategic planning framework of like, what will this look like if I am producing at this level in 5 years? What will I look like to myself? How will I feel? Is that actually possible for me to do? And maybe when I started this, I was able to, the output looked like this, but now it looks like this. And how do I adjust and flex as things change? Or maybe sometimes when we, I don't get to go deeply into grief today, but a lot of the work that I do with clients, sometimes I will have medical students who, medical school, for those of you who are not aware, I was not aware until I, to the level of this, until I started working with medical students, but it is really a different world. And it really doesn't create a lot of space for anything. You can't, I often joke with clients, like, you're not really allowed to be a human while you're in medical school. Like, human things aren't allowed to happen to you because there is no space to deal with them. And so sometimes I will have clients who experience some sort of tragedy, like they have a loss of a family member or something really big happens, or a trauma or something really big happens in their lives. And figuring out, like, this may look, my functioning during that time period may look different because I can't actually do both of these things at the same time, or I can't function at the level that I always have before because I'm going through this specific phase in my life. So sometimes realistic may look different depending on where you are at that time in your life. So we're really looking toward what is actually sustainable long term, and that may ebb and flow. Prioritizing wellness, balance, and prevention. I know wellness has become a really hot button word that we use in our society. We use on campuses a lot. I know we use the word a lot over here. We have days that we have blocked off for students called wellness days. But I think that oftentimes we fall into the category of, and I don't mean we, like as an entity of ETSU, I think that this is across the board culturally. I think that we oftentimes use the word wellness and we talk a lot about wellness, but when it comes to sort of more holistic, proactive, sustainable prevention, I don't oftentimes know what that looks like. I don't know if when we talk about wellness, we even fully know what we're saying. So this, can be expanded into much more than I'm giving you today, but a couple ideas around what this might look like for you, again, is something that's more ongoing and sustainable. So an example of something that you can take and do immediately, if possible, is take a look at your schedule, take a look at your work schedule, take a look at your schedule outside of work, and notice if there are patterns in which there is no wellness, there is no balance, there is no self-care involved. And I think many of you will likely notice that is probably true, because we tend to not even notice that these things are happening because our lives are so busy and complicated. So something that you can do that can be extremely helpful is on the front end, just sitting down one day, hopefully today, maybe after this, if this speaks to you, and starting to block off things in your schedule that your brain up until this point may have told you is flexible, or can be moved, or can be just readjusted or addressed some other time. So I'm talking lunch. I'm talking taking breaks for walking. I'm talking taking time off that you get as part of your benefits. And oftentimes these are things that we're like, yeah, I'll just deal with that when it's happening. And then it just doesn't happen because life happens instead. And there are always emergent things that come up, and there are always people who will need you, and there are things at your job that haven't been done. And this is true for students, right? There's always something you could be studying. There is always more that you could be doing. And these are really serious conversations I'm having with clients on a regular basis of, you could stay up all night and you have been, but look at you, you're not doing okay, right? It's actually doing the opposite of helping you on this exam. It's actually impacting your grades in a negative way because you're not taking care of yourself first. So a suggestion would be literally on my Outlook calendar, I have lunch blocked every day in capital letters. And the caps are sort of my reminder, like, this is not an optional thing. Okay. Your brain is going to probably sabotage you at times and say it is, but it's not. And so we're going to start with that. And then I have yoga, I put it on there every week. Does it happen every week? Absolutely not. Because none of us are perfect with this. And sometimes things just need to happen, right? So it doesn't need to necessarily be rigid, but it puts it up front in front of my face. It's where my schedule starts. And so naturally what happens is I work around those things. And sometimes those things need to be shifted and moved, and sometimes it doesn't work out, but that's okay because sometimes they do. And so then hopefully, most of the time I'm getting at least enough from those things that it's okay when things have to be adjusted, and I'm able to flow with that. And that actually moves into the other part of my talk, which is around resilience. And these things are connected in a lot of ways. So I strongly suggest considering doing something like that. Thinking about this really requires a mind shift. So conceptualizing your wellness and your balance and preventing or addressing burnout that you're already experiencing is that your health and wellness, your life longevity, which literally can be at stake when it comes to health issues that develop from these issues when they're not addressed over time, not seeing it as an optional thing. Because when you frame it like that, it really shouldn't be optional. Right? I mean, we're usually, not always, there's certainly, and working with medical students, people joke in the medical field, like, everyone needs to go to the doctor and to therapists except for me. So I'm not saying that everyone over here is like doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of that, or that I am either. But for the most part, I think that we, if someone is physically hurt or something is going on with them health-wise that's significant, that it would be understandable to encourage the person to go to the doctor as soon as possible. And so sometimes we don't see these things as emergent because in the moment they're not, but over time, these things do accumulate and do create chronic health conditions later in life, or at any time. And I had an example on here about not skipping the dentist appointment that I absolutely recently did and immediately regretted because I now have to wait 7 months to get my teeth cleaned. And I would have already been on my next cleaning by then, right? So so this is me, making it personal and letting you know that I'm not coming from a place of being like, I know how to, avoid burnout at all costs, and I'm so well and balanced all of the time. It's, for all of us, this is a journey and this is a challenge. And it's something that we sort of have to work at on a daily basis. Also shifting the mindset that, and this is really common for me with clients in therapy, working through this mindset shift, because this is not the story that most of us have been told our entire lives. Oftentimes I have a client respond with, what you're describing sounds like being selfish. And I don't want to be I worry about being selfish. And so I want to assure you today that meeting your own needs, taking care of yourself first, is not selfish. It is actually taking care of others as well. And it is what I would encourage you to do, whether you're in a helping profession or not. You have relationships probably with some people in your life. You have family members probably. You work with other people. This impacts all of those things. And when you meet your needs, when you fill your cup, it's like the cheesy, it's like the airplane analogy, right? With the oxygen mask. Right, you get instructed to put on your mask first and then the child's, right? Without the context of why that is, that would seem really terrible, right? So you're like, save yourself, kid, right? But the reality is that you need the oxygen first, because if you pass out, you're no good to anybody, yourself or the child, right? It's imperative that you go first so that you can care for the child. So same thing. When you care for yourself first, when you focus on your oxygen first, it actually helps to take care of other people and to address what needs to get done. So you become more capable of doing your job. Your excellence, your ability to function in your job and overperform increases when you are more balanced. So yeah, that's a really important mind shift that sometimes takes people a while to wrap their minds around. But my hope is that in your experience, the argument, if you want to have this conversation, if you feel like it's a safe conversation to have with a supervisor or with colleagues, is that you can prove to them over time that this works. Because when you fill your cup, you will have more to give. You'll have more energy, more focus. It's pretty amazing. But it does the opposite than what we would naturally think. And it's worth asking these kind of questions. Is it good or healthy to be consistently given positive feedback for neglecting myself? Is it good or healthy to think it's a good thing to sacrifice, and a brag-worthy right to talk about sacrificing my own needs? This happens with medical professionals all the time and students all the time. People have bragging rights around if they've stayed up multiple nights in a row and are still functioning. I don't know about you, but I don't want to have surgery performed on me from someone who hasn't slept in 3 days, right? But it's seen as almost like a badge of honor that you are capable of doing that and still surviving. But on the other end of that, you can develop, after 3 nights or however many nights of sleep deprivation, you can develop psychosis. So, I think that like the message that we have sent for a really long time is that that's something to be proud of, or that's something to aim for, and it's actually quite dangerous. So I would recommend not looking like this sweet little ostrich over here. And just sticking your head in the sand and being like, this is not happening, this is not happening. I'm feeling some of these symptoms. We're having this conversation. I'm not really ready to face that. It's okay if you're, still sort of like the place of contemplation or pre-contemplation. But it's worth noting if any of these things feel like they're ringing true for you today, or you're feeling a little defensive as I'm talking. That's always a good measure as well. Like if you start to feel defensive, it's like, but this probably applies to me. So if you feel like you have a safe relationship with your supervisor to have these kind of conversations, maybe just in, sort of penciling in a reminder to yourself in your next annual evaluation, maybe bringing it up with your supervisor and having a conversation about what your workload looks like and how that might be impacting you, maybe on a daily basis, or maybe noticing the connection between that and how you're performing over time. Maybe talking about your schedule structure and seeing if there's any sort of flexibility. I have had different experiences in different areas at ETSU. I've worked in multiple departments, and I've been in situations that I've worked in all sorts of jobs outside of ETSU, and I've had different experiences with supervisors who are more stringent with schedule structure and are more flexible with schedule structure. And I have, and this is totally anecdotal, but there's also research on this. I've noticed a significant difference in terms of my inspiration that's very sort of like natural and innate, to work extra hard and do my very best and like really prove myself, to make their lives easier, when I feel like that's also being considered in my direction as well. So I think that, for anyone who's listening who might be in a supervisory role, I think that you can make so much positive change in areas like this by working with your employees around, getting creative about problem solving. And what I've learned working, in a different entity at the same institution is that at one point I was told that some things that weren't possible that absolutely were possible. It was just the person had to be willing to give it a try, and that's made a huge difference for me. Diversifying tasks, maybe part of burnout is because you're tired of the things that you're doing every day and it becomes sort of monotonous. And so what are things that you can brainstorm with, a supervisor or colleagues to make things more interesting for yourself, or to maybe like help you grow and challenge yourself, within the context of that role. Take breaks. The ETSU's, it's supposed to be a 37.5-hour work week. But we don't work 7.5 hours a day. We have 8.5 hours a day, right, that we're supposed to be here. And so one of those hours is supposed to be your lunch. And again, like if you don't prioritize it, if you're lucky and you have someone, supervisors who their colleagues who also prioritize that, and you kind of hold each other accountable, use each other as external motivators, that is so wonderful. And I'm so glad that you have that. But not everybody experiences that at their jobs. And so absolutely remember to advocate for yourself or prioritize for yourself if nobody else is going to prioritize it for you. Your oxygen mask first. And don't forget to take actual elongated breaks. You do have time that is part of your benefits package here at ETSU. And if you're a full-time employee, and did you know that if you accumulate too much annual leave, it doesn't carry over? Some of you might know that, and that means you've probably worked too hard in the past and maybe still are, right? You definitely should not have so much time off that it's too much to even take and then you lose it before you go into the next year. It doesn't mean you can take breaks all the time, but that's also something that can help with burnout in terms of being able to look out into the future and have something exciting to plan for or to look forward to. And then when you do have breaks, like for instance, built-in things, like for instance, we have Veterans Day this Friday. Maybe there are some boxes you need to check. Maybe there are some things that you need to do, or is there time this weekend in order that you can use to really focus on getting some rest and recuperating and getting to a place where you maybe feel more ready and more fresh on Monday to come back to work. And then definitely utilize those benefits. You have, if you're an employee of ETSU, you have benefits. You have the employee assistance program, which includes 5 to 6 free sessions of therapy with certain therapists in the area. And after that, it's only your medical copay. So it's a really great deal. And ideally, whatever you're doing is something that's sustainable and ongoing. Not to downplay one-time, one-stop self-care moments. They're really important. I, using myself again as an example, I booked a massage way ahead of time for Veterans Day, because I was like, that's a day that I usually would be working, and it's not eating into other stuff that I have to do on the weekend. And that is something that I am going to commit to doing. And I'm not going to have so many things scheduled that I'm rushing there and rushing out. And so it's just this blip sort of in that day that's supposed to be off for me. I'm taking time before and after. I'm really creating space. And I had to really intentionally plan for that ahead of time because I knew that my future self would thank me. And I know on Friday, my current self will be like, oh, thank you, past Kate, for recognizing that you needed this. So one-time self-care moments are absolutely important as well. But even in that way, it's kind of sustainable, right? It's like a consistent practice that I'm learning to do. It becomes a pattern in my life where I remember to, or remind myself to schedule things out so that I can take care of my future self. And some examples of things that you can do on a more ongoing basis. I strongly encourage things like yoga and meditation is technically a type of yoga. And the neat thing about yoga is it's combining meditative practice and focus on the breath with focus on the body and the soul and heart and all of the things. Like I just think that there's a lot of combination in the practice of yoga that helps to address everything at one time. And what the research shows is that over time, when you do things like yoga and when you do things like meditation consistently, over time, you notice a really significant difference in the way you feel in your body, in the way that you can handle things at work, in your focus and concentration, in your ability to regulate your emotions, in your ability to communicate with other people, and your ability to recognize gratitude, be present, just breathe, which is not something that always comes very naturally to us, at least in a therapeutic way. So if that's not something you've ever tried before, the CPA has free classes. Like I mentioned, I block that stuff on my schedule. I pop right over to the CPA on the days that I'm able to do that. And some weeks, I spend the whole week just kind of hanging on and saying, Friday will come and I will get to do my yin yoga with Sherry. She's so excellent and it feels so good. And it actually helps me get through. And I think do a better job as an employee in a lot of ways. Therapy, I am a therapist, so of course I would argue that therapy is excellent and you should absolutely do it, but there's also a ton of research that you can look up on your own to explore the efficacy of therapy, either individual or group practice, and you can get it for free through your EAP, or if you are a student, you can get it through campus for free. There's a lot of research on the connection between our brain functioning and nature. So I encourage you, we live in such a beautiful area. It's a beautiful time of year. Sometimes what I will do during my lunch breaks is I will take my lunch and then I will go outside. I will try to spend some of that time taking a walk, maybe listening to a meditation or talking to someone on the phone, getting reconnected with somebody. So sometimes it's about doing multiple things at one time in a positive way, not too much multitasking, but trying to fit multiple, aspects of that in. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward because I want to make sure I leave time for questions today as well. But of course, social connection and spiritual connection for a lot of people is really important to sometimes get outside of yourself a little bit and to focus on connecting with somebody else. We definitely need that as humans. And in terms of spirituality piece, I think it's really important for most of us to see or experience something that's bigger than or outside of ourselves. Someone did a presentation recently for the medical students and was talking about sort of how they conceptualize, because these students are experiencing a really intense, challenging time in their lives, and it's all consuming. And he's a doctor as well. And he was talking about, he was like, sometimes I just like to think of myself as, what I really am, which is, the expanse of time and space, just like a grain of sand, like my entire life, the whole thing. It's just like a, and then this one moment or this one thing that's happening to you right now, even in the context of the expanse of your whole life, and then you as a grain of sand in the expanse of the universe, it helps to put things in perspective. So that's not to scare you, but more as a perspective shift when things feel so big that you can't handle them. And that's what anxiety does, is it tells us things are so big that the sky is going to fall, or we can't do it. And sometimes just pulling ourselves outside of our brains and being able to recognize the reality of that from a different context can be a really great thing. And I'm really big on rest, and we'll get into that as well. Okay. And I talked a lot about this already, so I'm going to move forward into moving into resilience. So some definitions of resilience: the ability of a person to adjust to or recover readily from illness, adversity, major life changes. Buoyancy, from the Defense Centers of Excellence, they say the ability to withstand, recover, and or grow in the face of stressors and changing demands, which is an interesting definition. I'm going to revisit that in a minute. I'm sorry, and I skipped the American Psychological Association, the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. I don't know if any of you have seen or are familiar with ETSU's Strong Brain Institute Resilience series, but there are about a half hour to 60 minutes of these great resiliency talks. And Nikita Gupta was one of the presenters. I haven't seen all of them, but hers really struck me, and I really enjoyed her way of presenting. So I'm going to share some of the things that she shared in hers, and of course give her credit for that. I was very impressed with her presentation, but her argument is that we are inherently resilient. And one of the reasons for this is we all started as a single cell organism and grew into this body we now inhabit, which when you think about it is amazing, right? It's built into our cellular structure, right? We started as a single cell organism, and we're thinking, breathing, feeling humans who live these full lives. It's incredible. So it's in our cellular structure. We're resilient. And her argument is that the goal is not necessarily to become more resilient or to like find more resilience than we already have. What she's arguing is that we have it already. It's natural to us. We just may not have cultivated access to that since childhood for whatever reason. And sometimes it involves connecting with the deeper parts of ourselves and learning to slow down. And that is a lot of the therapeutic work that I do with clients. And we're not even using the word resilience. I'm using it a lot more since I've been doing research for this presentation and making sort of connections between a lot of the things that I do with clients and how I talk about these things with realizing like, oh, that's what we're doing is we're really cultivating people's natural resilience. But it requires some of that work, which is why things like learning how to meditate, learning how to breathe deeply, to take space, and time to slow ourselves down. We are not a slow culture. Being from the Northeast, being in this area is slower, but even within, the context of that, we work for a university, and sometimes processes at universities take a really long time, but a lot of time, I think the daily function that we feel tends to be very rushed, tends to be very fast paced. And we just tend to live very busy lives in modern society. So there's a lot. So it requires very intentional slowing down in order to connect with ourselves and some of this. And I think that there are arguments in both directions around whether resilience is something that's natural to someone based on their life experiences, or whether that, I've heard people say like resilience can't be taught. But like Nikita Gupta is arguing, we all have it. So I imagine to a degree it can be taught to all of us because it is something we can make to us that maybe we've just lost connection with or never really had cultivated connection with. Great news. We're all born with it. We can build it, and we don't need to do it alone, and nor should we do it alone, because connection to others is actually essential to our being. In terms of the Defense Centers of Excellence definition that I mentioned before, the definition refers to resilience as an ability, suggesting that it does not come as a stable, unchanging quality. It allows for recovering from stressors and for growth, and it focuses on changing demands, which suggests a process that occurs over time. So clearly, this is not something static and something that, I think that there's a lot of hope in terms of growing and changing with resilience. So this also requires redefining strength and bravery. I think we get a lot of messaging what strength and bravery look like. And, as someone who practices therapy and counseling with people, a lot of the culture, and it depends on what community or culture you're coming from, but a lot of cultural and community messaging and family of origin messaging or professional, whatever profession you're in, that messaging does not equate strength and bravery with seeking help, with admitting that you are not okay, with admitting that you have feelings and you don't know how to handle them, with being vulnerable, all of these things on this list that I'm showing you, which are connected to becoming more resilient, to tapping into that resilience. So the example I had with a client I recently spoke with, they were exploring this experience that they had where they, for the first time in their lives, had made this decision to stop in the middle of doing something that they imagined was something they had to do to prove something to who knows who, maybe them partially themselves, but also maybe others. And when they made this choice to let go and to accept, because they've been doing all of this therapeutic work to listen to themselves and trust themselves, they knew at this juncture that they had to make this choice for themselves. And so they did. And they had at first really struggled with that because it was the first time in their life that they felt like they were quitting something, or like were too weak to continue doing something that was actually harming them, and was only for them. So they recognized that there was no sense in continuing to do something that was only serving to harm them, or that they realized that they were sort of at the end of the road with, and recognized through the process of working through it in therapy that it was one of the wisest decisions they've ever made. Right. But the first thing that had come up for them, and so they asked this question, am I weaker or am I wiser for making this decision? Because one of the first things that came up in their heads was that they were weaker for doing it. So learning to trust your inner voice, and part of this is what I mentioned earlier and what Nikita Gupta talked about, which is, silencing other things and learning just to breathe and to take space is how we start to learn to cultivate our inner voice and listen to that. And then once we have this relationship with that voice, learning to use it, whether it's to advocate for yourself assertively, set boundaries, ask for help from others, learning to, these are the kind of things that we practice in therapy, at least I do as a practitioner, learning to regulate your emotions, learning to regulate your physiological responses. And physiological responses are oftentimes responses to trauma, to anxiety or stress, to stressful situations that we might have at our jobs or in other areas of our lives. Facing vulnerability, that we are as humans naturally vulnerable in some capacity, all of us really. Facing and coping with shame and trauma. More people than I think we realize have experienced some level of trauma. And I think we also sometimes have the definition of trauma kind of confused. There are many things that could diagnostically be trauma that we don't usually consider or classify as that. I'm going to move into talking about in a moment Brene Brown's work, which is around vulnerability and shame, which is really important in connection to this. So as I mentioned before, we are not meant to do this alone. And one of the articles that I was looking at was actually talking about resilience of systems. And it argued that resilience in the individual is highly dependent on social systems that provide positive support, and that these systems enhance resilience through a variety of psychosocial and neurobiological mechanisms. So this is more of the argument for social systems in your life, but also if you, again, are in a supervisory position here at ETSU, or you have any sort of influence over any groups or departments, that it would be helpful to consider these things. And when you think about sort of how you function and how you communicate and relate to employees within different departments, because that can make a huge difference. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Brene Brown, she has a PhD in social work, and she is a very famous researcher of topics such as vulnerability and shame. If you have not seen her TED Talks on vulnerability and shame in that order, I really highly recommend you take a look. And she has several books out. Her most recent one, I think, is called Dare to Lead. And her work is really fascinating. So her argument is that adaptability to change, which sounds a lot like resilience, right, is all about vulnerability. And vulnerability is emotional risk, exposure, and uncertainty, and it is our most accurate measurement of courage, right? So she makes a lot of these arguments around the connection between bravery and strength and vulnerability, which is not something common to our, that's not usually what we think of when we think of words like strength and bravery culturally. So again, big mind shift. She argues that vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And she has worked with countless companies and organizations to kind of change the structure and the more systemic approach to how employees function within these structures. Because vulnerability, again, is not something that we oftentimes bring into work. Adaptability to change is all about vulnerability. And we have, in order to address vulnerability, we have to talk about shame. And so in her second TED Talk, her first TED Talk was about vulnerability. And that was like sort of where she started with this research. And then she realized in doing that research and doing that TED Talk that there was no way to avoid addressing shame. And then she shares a little bit about her own story. And so she basically described learning about vulnerability and courage and creativity and innovation from studying shame. And so in case you're not familiar with the difference between those, because a lot of times people use these words interchangeably, they say, I felt a lot of guilt and shame. They're actually very different. So guilt is the idea of doing something bad. So for instance, you might say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Shame is, I am bad. I'm sorry, I am a mistake. You feel the difference between those two things. And in some of the trauma work that I do with clients, I'm actually trained in EMDR, which is a non-talk therapy intervention. And that requires a negative belief that is based in shame. So it's always about, even if something was done to another person by someone else or had nothing to do with them specifically, oftentimes the story that we create in our trauma or if we experience something related to shame is that, like, I am bad, or it's something about me innately, inherently. And Brene Brown also describes shame as basically, you're never good enough and who you think you are. So if you've ever, and she uses examples. I've heard her talk about this in the podcast about, being done with an interview with a really important person and asking, like, was that good enough? So even something, with her level of fame and influence, still questions like if she's good enough. And she talks about how shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders. But then the research shows that guilt is actually inversely correlated with those things. So they're very different in that way. And so the argument is that the ability to hold something that we've done or that we do up against who we want to be is this incredibly uncomfortable but adaptive mechanism. So it's this idea of almost like, and a lot of the work in therapy can be around cultivating and developing your ego strength and your belief in yourself and love for yourself, so that you're able to look at things that you've done or that you're doing and recognize the separation. Like, this feels like the difference between shame and something that's outside of shame, that like, this doesn't define who I am. This is something that I'm doing, and I believe in myself enough to know that like I can make changes to be, who I want to be, this future, like this better version of myself. And that's that vulnerability piece, and that is strength, and that is adaptation. And her argument also through her research is that she's pretty sure that the only people without the capacity for shame are also people who don't have the capacity for connection or empathy. So essentially she's arguing, like, outside of having antisocial personality disorder, which is not an ideal scenario, we all have this in common. So it's better to have some shame than the alternative. And so that is something that connects almost all of us, that to some degree, we all experience this, even if we're not fully aware of that that's what's happening. And interestingly, in terms of connection to others and the importance of that, empathy is the antidote to shame. So shame grows in secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I think a lot about the work that I do with clients around trauma, oftentimes things that happen to people that are traumatic involve secrecy, silence, and judgment. And so, creating a space in which people can voice what's going on, in which people can share and not feel judged, and be met with empathy. This in terms of like, and this is where I would encourage you to read her book, Dare to Lead. If you're in a position of leadership or supervision, it can make such an impact on your employees to work with empathy, and to, just structure the framework around the workspace, around the idea of that, which is, again, it's pretty innovative. It's not always how it looks in most workspaces. So I'm almost out of time here. So I do want to make sure that I have some time for questions. So I'm not going to deeply revisit all of these things I've already told you to do. So please, if you've never done therapy before, I encourage you to consider it. Talk to and connect with others, join a group or a club or a team or a place of worship so that you can have connection to others in the sense of belonging. Consider practices that involve meditation. There are so many apps out there that are free that you can use. Again, free yoga classes at the CPA that are open to students and employees. Check out Brene Brown's work. Watch Nikita Gupta's Strong Brain Institute presentation and other presentations. There's a lot there. And I already mentioned some of these resources. And also just sometimes breathing feels like something we do all day, right, to keep us alive. But it's so interesting that it's like one of the only things we absolutely have to be doing at all times. And it's like we don't even know it's happening almost 100% of the time, right? So we really take that for granted. And I wrote down this quote for this presentation. It popped up in my meditation app when I did my meditation yesterday morning. And it is, sometimes the most important thing in a whole day is the rest we take between two deep breaths. And I don't have time to go over this, so I'm just going to, again, encourage you to watch that Strong Brain Institute presentation. But this is sort of that work of cultivating a relationship with your body, where you pause to notice how you feel after you interact with somebody. Or you have like a staff meeting, or you have some sort of argument with a family member or something like that, just noticing what's coming up and tuning and addressing that. Last week, we had a wellness day for some of our medical students, and I did a presentation on suicide prevention, which I think can be very triggering, and it's a bit of a downer. It's so important to talk about, but it's a lot for them. And I could just feel like just the air got sucked out of the room, and they're sitting there for a really long time. And I was doing everybody up. So when we finished the presentation, everybody stood up and we did some vigorous shaking movements, just to kind of get some of that released out of our bodies. And this is a quote from Amy Purdy, who I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she is a Olympic snowboarder, I think. And she lost both of her legs, and so she and then became an Olympic snowboarder because she's amazing. And one of her, quotes from her is, "The best way to build resiliency is to push through the urge to give up. You don't wake up resilient; you become resilient through practice." And of course, Nikita would argue like, well, you were born resilient, right? But it requires practice sometimes. And like the example with my client, I wouldn't encourage you to push through something that you know deep down is not right for you. That's the work of trusting your gut, which is a beautiful and encouraged thing. But sometimes we do have to push ourselves through things that are hard or challenging or new in order to cultivate that natural resilience that we all have. And there's my references. And here's my contact information in case that's helpful to any of you all. I really appreciate your time and attention today. And I will now open it up for questions. Thank you, Alyssa.
Or just giving anyone time to ask a question, but definitely want to thank you, Kate, for leading this presentation. This is one of those lunch and learns where we can go back and listen to it just to get the tips.
Yeah.
This is just perfect timing for this time of season, this time of the academic semester. Would like to thank our friends from financial aid for attending this particular session. But if we don't have any questions, just would like to remind everyone that our final lunch and learn for the fall semester is Wednesday, November 15th. We'll have Dr. Leonard Garda and Ann Gimler coming to talk about deaf issues. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate it.